You are perhaps the only world leader here at the moment who is in Davos, but also went to the inauguration in Washington. And I wonder, you know, America was celebrating. Should the world celebrate the arrival of President Trump?
Definitely, the world should celebrate the arrival of President Trump. His speech was clear and decisive, and that golden era he proposes for the United States will shine a light for the whole world, as it will spell the end of the woke ideology that is doing so much damage to the world.
One thing, though, just to push you a little bit, you have always been a free trader. You're a great fan of Margaret Thatcher and Milton Friedman. But President Trump is coming, and he is bringing tariffs, he's bringing protectionism. I wondered, how can a disciple of Milton Friedman and Margaret Thatcher like that kind of economics?
Well, first of all, I am in no position to give an opinion on another country's trade policy. I think it would be irresponsible and disrespectful towards any country. On the other hand, I think that unlike other leaders, Trump understands very well geopolitics and uses the U.S. trade geopolitics as part of the broader geopolitics. It's not that he is protectionist. Rather, he knows what the role of the U.S. in the world is, and therefore, his trade policy is a part of his geopolitical strategy. It is a geopolitical tool. That's the point. So if you fail to understand the playing field that Trump is playing on, it'll be hard to understand his vision. But certainly, the guidelines he is putting forward will bring a much better world, no doubt.
Did you discuss a free trade agreement with Argentina, with President Trump or his advisors?
We are working very hard on the possibility of entering into a free trade agreement, and in fact, when I recently took over as pro tempore president of Mercosur, I pointed out that Mercosur should move forward on three fronts. One related to the fight against terrorism, drug trafficking, and that is also easy to move forward on, bringing down the common external tariff, but also being able to make progress independently. In other words, that each of our countries should have independence to be able to work on trade agreements, because clearly Argentina has decided to become integrated into the rest of the world. It wants to go back to its golden era in history, what was an important world player. And for that, we need to move forward on free trade agreements. We need to open up the economy, and Mercosur can't become an obstacle to that. Therefore, while we work with the US government to move towards a free trade agreement, we also work indoors within Mercosur so that it won't be an obstacle to move towards free trade. So we're working very hard on that.
Would you leave, very quickly, would you leave Mercosur to do a free trade agreement with America?
Well, if the extreme condition were that, yes. However, there are mechanisms that can be used even being within Mercosur. So we think that it can be done without necessarily having to leave Mercosur as such. And it's also worth noting this, because often when comments on the negative consequences of leaving Mercosur, reference is made to the automotive industry. But the automotive industry has an agreement outside the framework of Mercosur, so that is a false argument. So we are exploring ways for Argentina to be able to open up to international trade. And why? Because the division of labor brings prosperity. Adam Smith said so. And 250 years later, Dad holds true. Adam Smith is still right.
I'm always pro-Adam Smith. Since I came and saw you in April last year, and I checked, you have actually done very well. I will pay you tribute. When I arrived last year, Argentina's inflation was more than 10% a month. Now you brought it down below 3%. Sovereign bonds were 50 cents. Now they're trading at 70. The economy is no longer in recession. You've done a lot by any measure, and that's one reason why people clap you so fiercely. But there are more challenges ahead, and one big one is capital controls. I know that you want to lift them, but can you tell me when you will do that?
Well, if you will allow me, a little correction on the figures. First, retail inflation is now even below 3%, and we have a crawling peg scheme which includes a 2.5% limit, and since for 3 months we've been in line with the crawling peg, we've decided to bring it down to 1%. So induced inflation in Argentina now, consumer inflation, will go from 2.5%, our aim now being 1.5%. And the inflation that matters is wholesale inflation. That's what counts, because it's not contaminated by tariff effects, and it's the one on utility rate effects. When we took office, it was 54%, which is 17,000% annualized, and the latest wholesale inflation data point to 0.8%. So on the wholesale front, for several months now, we have had deflation in dollars. And regarding economic activity, the third quarter, which is the one for which we have the latest GDP data, the figure was 3.9%. So if you annualize that, Argentina is expanded at 17% annually. And if you take the floor in the economy in April, when it bottomed out, we could be talking about 10 or 11% expansion annually. And let me say this, which is very important. We have just really done away with all economic theory handbooks. Generally, it is said that during a recession, you need to pursue expansionary fiscal and monetary policies. However, in our case, amidst the recession, and besides we really had the components of the worst crises in Argentina's history. We had monetary imbalances similar to those in the time of the Rodrigazo crisis. We also had central bank account imbalances even worse than prior to the 1989 hyperinflation under President Alfonsín. We had social indicators that were even worse than those just before the convertibility program. And when you look at other cases in which these large-scale adjustments need to be made, our fiscal adjustment was 15% of GDP. So 10 and 5, central bank and treasury. And when you look at other experiences, normally GDP tends to fall about 15% in such circumstances. And the way the figures stand, the year should be closing with a 2% fall. But the interesting thing is that the statistical drive was 2.8% as far as the fall is concerned. So the economy is better off than what we received, and so much so that when you look at the deseasonalized series, for the monthly economic activity indicator, November is already above the level when we took office. And why? Because, you see, the interesting thing is we made the largest fiscal adjustment in history, and during a recession we lowered inflation from 54 to 0.8%. And in dollar terms, we have a deflation. But at the same time, the economy has expanded. And we inherited monthly poverty of 57%, and now it will be 36%. So we brought it down by 21 percentage points. This means that we have lifted some 10 million Argentines out of poverty.
You've done a great job, and that's what I said, and you have now said at even greater length that you have done a great job.
Bueno, pero hay que ponerle precisión a los números.
I just wanted to make sure
you said
we got the figures right.
You will eliminate capital controls sometime this year. I wondered, can you be more specific? Will it be the first half of this year or the second half?
Nosotros siempre, nosotros estamos comprometidos.
We are committed to lifting the currency controls and capital controls. We are committed to that because we believe that the controls are an expropriation tool on the part of the public sector.
Los gobiernos anteriores abusaban.
Past governments abused the money printing and generated inflation, and people wanted to switch portfolios to protect themselves. And the controls were introduced in order to artificially create more demand for pesos. And this increased and expanded the base of the inflationary tax, which was really cheating people out of the money. So these controls not only restrain freedom, but go against property rights. And as a libertarian, I respect the right to life and property, and of course I'm going to do away with it. But I'm a libertarian liberal. I'm not just a silly liberal. I'm not going to actually deviate from that, because it's about flows and stocks, you see. We have found that we need to define the conditions to remove the controls. One of them is that induced inflation should converge vis-à-vis observed inflation. So now we are moving on to a crawling peg of 1%. What will happen after 3 months if the figure of inflation is 1.5%? This means that we would be converging in terms of inflation, and we would have to do away with the crawling peg. And another thing we have set as a condition is that the observed monetary base should coincide with the broad base, so that we will be sure that the money overhang generated by currency controls will go away, and when we open up and lift the controls, there will be no run. And the third point has to do with the possibility of getting finance. But why is financing important? Because this brings forward in time the end of the currency controls. We will be doing away with the controls at a point when we again rebuild the stock balance in the central bank. The difference is that if we secure the financing, the exit will be faster. This is also very important. Any kind of agreement we may enter into with the IMF, with investment funds, and or with investment funds, means funds coming into the Treasury's coffers that will be used not to finance the Treasury, because the Treasury is in a fiscal balance position. It will be used to repurchase debt as far as the central bank is concerned, which is, by the way, the Treasury's largest creditor. And this has several effects. The total debt does not increase. It's just the composition of it that changes, but you rebuild the central bank balance sheets, and the more solvent the central bank is, the balance price level is lower, and if you take the current price level and the long term, the slope gives you inflation. When you rebuild the central bank balance sheets, you also bring down long-term inflation. So what you're going to do, if we secure the financing, is ensure that this is a lot faster. Again, we're going to end the controls no matter what. The thing is the speed. The more financing we get, the sooner we'll get out.
It depends on the IMF. You have this, at this moment you are negotiating with the IMF. At the moment Argentina has a $44 billion program. Are you trying to get an increase on that? Or would you be happy with just rolling over the 44 billion?
Una parte tiene que ver con
part of it has to do with the structure of payments, and another
to push them further out.
Claro. Y otra parte tiene que ver
and another part
con conseguir
has to
fondos
do
nuevos
with getting fresh
para
funds
recomponer las cuentas del Banco
to
Central,
rebuild
los stocks,
the central
y de
bank
esa manera
accounts, the stocks,
acelerar la salida del cepo.
and thereby
Es decir,
accelerate
la salida del cepo no está
the lifting of the
discusión.
currency
Lo
controls.
que,
That
pero, digamos,
is
yo no puedo
not
plantear una salida
being
del cepo
discussed.
si
It's
yo no
definitely
sé
going
de
to happen,
cuánto,
but I can't
digamos,
consider
cuánto
lifting
dinero
the
estamos
controls if I don't know how
hablando,
much
no
money
sobre
we're talking about.
el cuánto, sino
And it's not just
el
about how
cómo.
much, but about how.
Porque también depende, porque yo lo que tengo que hacer es
Because what I
calzar
need
los
to
flujos de
do
fondos.
is match the flows of
Entonces la clave
funds.
está ahí.
So the
Entonces, toda
key
esta negociación
is about that.
es decir,
This whole negotiation
lo que queda claro es nosotros vamos a
makes
salir
it
del
clear
cepo,
that we
lo que
are going to
la
lift the
salida del cepo
controls,
dependerá,
but
la
the
velocidad
exit
va a depender
will
de cuánto
depend in terms of the speed on
sea el monto de la operación
the amount of the
y cómo la
operation
operación esté
and on
estructurada.
how the operation is
Si no es lo
structured.
mismo si
In
yo
other words,
recibo
it's
todo
not
el
the same
dinero
if I
cash
get all
que
of the
si lo
money
recibo en cuotas.
cash
Es
as
decir, yo lo
opposed
que
to in
necesito calzar
installments.
es un flujo
What
de
I need
fondos.
to match is a flow of funds.
On that specific, would you like more than 44 billion? Just yes or no?
Sí, obvio, digamos.
Yes, of
habría
course.
fondos frescos.
There would be fresh funds.
Está bien, pero lo que es
Yes,
importante
right. But what
lo que es
matters here,
importante
what's
es
important,
que esos fondos
is that
nuevos
the new
no van a
fresh
incrementar
funds
la deuda
will
social de
not
Argentina
increase
porque
Argentina's
esos
total
fondos
debt
van a ser
because
utilizados
they
para
will be
cancelar
used
deuda
to pay
que está
off
en manos del Banco Central.
debt
El
that
máximo
is held by the
acreedor
central
del
bank.
Tesoro
The
Nacional es el
national
Banco Central,
treasury's
fruto de que, por
largest
ejemplo, el
creditor is the central bank,
estafaba a los argentinos
because
colocándole
Kirchneris actually
líquidos al Banco
cheated
Central,
Argentines by
llevándose las
placing
reservas.
illiquid
Entonces, lo que nosotros estamos, lo que
bonds
nosotros
in the
estamos
central bank
buscando
and took
hacer
away
es
the reserves. So what
recomponer
we are
el
trying
activo
to
del
do
Banco
is
Central
rebuild the
para que de
assets,
esa manera
replenish the assets of the central
ir
bank
liberándose los
so
stocks, o sea,
as
las
to
deudas, digamos,
free up
que hay
the
con,
stocks
por
and
ejemplo, pendientes de pago
pay
de
off
dividendos.
the dividend
another
debts,
one
for
of your
example.
major-
Y además, claro,
Sorry, one more thing.
hemos avanzado muchísimo en la salida
We
del
have
cepo.
made great
Cuando nosotros
progress
llegamos al
towards
poder,
lifting the
solamente
controls.
se pagaba
When
el
we
10%
came
de
into
las
office,
importaciones.
only 10% of
Hoy
imports
se paga
was being paid,
prácticamente
and now
100%.
nearly
O sea,
100% is
con
being
lo cual ha
paid.
habido
So
enormes
there has
mejoras.
been enormous
Bueno, digamos, o sea,
improvement,
quedan pequeños detalles
and there are
para
still
hacer.
some fine details to
Another
finalize
sort of
this.
predator out there, another big investor is China. Historically, you were not a fan of China, I think it would be fair to say. But the Chinese government has lent Argentina's central bank more than $18 billion. Plenty of Chinese investment in Argentina. You said you were going to go to Beijing this month. Is that still going to happen?
Nosotros hemos tenido unas reuniones muy
We've
positivas,
had some very
tanto
fruitful
con
meetings
la gente de
with
la embajada de
the
China,
Chinese
con
embassy
Xi Jinping,
and
que
with
la
Xi
reunión
Jinping,
la tuvimos
a
en
meeting
Brasil
which
cuando
we
fue la
had
reunión del
in
G20.
Brazil during the G20
Y
summit.
nosotros consideramos que somos economías
And
complementarias.
we consider that our economies are complementary and that there's a lot for us to do together as great trade
La
partners.
contracara a esos swaps
So the
tiene que ver
flip
con
side
las
of the
situaciones
swaps
comerciales.
has to do
Y la
with
idea es
commercial
profundizar la relación
situations. The
comercial.
idea is to
Así es
deepen
que,
the trade
es más,
relationship.
de hecho,
In fact,
nosotros estamos planeando hacer
we
una visita a
intend
China.
to pay a visit to China.
But are you a bit like President Trump? Do you appreciate China more now you are in office?
A veces también uno tiene que aprender.
Well, sometimes you also need to learn.
Yes.
¿Usted no aprende todos los días?
Don't you learn something new every day?
Can I ask, yes, we always try. You have one particular thing. Will you go back to the international...
Bueno, yo si no aprendo, perjudico a los argentinos.
Well, if I fail to learn, I will harm the Argentines. So have extra pressure to learn fast.
What about going back to the international bond markets? When do you think you will hope to do that? To go and raise money by yourself, without the IMF, without talking to China? When do you think you would?
A ver, nosotros eso, a ver, si usted se fija,
well, if you take a look, when we won the election, country risk was about 3,000 basis points. When we took office, the market was starting to believe because country risk had gone down to 1,900. Recently, it had pierced the 600 basis points. Now it has bounced back. Obviously, profit taking is only natural. That should be no cause for concern, but we have a zero deficit fiscal rule on the financial line. So if you have zero deficit, you don't take on new debt. So the debt to GDP ratio is a decreasing one. Moreover, this is the first government during our most recent democratic period. This is the first government that has brought the debt down by $30 billion. In this past year. So Argentina has a position of solvency that is very powerful, and this is about zero deficit. At the same time, the impact this has on country risk and on the interest rate makes Argentina find a trend growth floor of 4.5%, which means that in 50 years' time, Argentina would have the same per capita GDP as the United States in 50 years' time, with the United States keeping the current rates. But you should also consider that the adjustment was made by bringing down public spending, not by raising taxes, because in fact we gave people back about 15 percentage points of GDP. And not just that, we have also undertaken the largest structural reform in the history of Argentina, which was 8 times larger in scale than that under President Milei, through an emergency decree and a comprehensive reform package bill. But every day, our wonderful, marvelous, genius deregulation minister, Federico Sturzenegger, does away with regulations, and about 4 every day. So we're on the way to certainly becoming the freest country in the world at some point.
You have your friend Elon Musk. He is trying to do the same thing in America.
Just hold on, because I didn't fully answer the previous question, and what you asked previous is very important. This means that the debt to GDP ratio profile in Argentina comes down a lot. So when we finally free the currency controls, we lift them, the risk rating agencies will greatly improve our ratings and will be able to go out to market very easily. Because it's not that we need debt in order to cover deficit. We would just be rolling over debt in a decreasing debt to GDP context. So that will happen easily, and that's why it's so important for us to go into 2026 without controls.
Government efficiency. You are famous for your chainsaw, for taking this axe, this chainsaw to Argentine government. In America, you have Elon Musk, your friend, who's trying to do the same thing. Voy a hacer
una mención adicional.
Let me make another point. The owner of the chainsaw is another one of my brilliant ministers, Luis Toto Caputo. He's the one who undertook the cuts, and this is very important. It's not just the...
lend him to President Trump.
O sea, no solo tanto lo necesito en Argentina.
I need him in Argentina because I want to continue to bring down spending, to continue to lower taxes.
Pero a lo que quiero decir es lo siguiente.
But what I mean is this.
Ahí también
this is important.
Quiero ponderar el excelente trabajo de
I would also like to praise the great job done by my brilliant minister, Toto Caputo, because it's not just about making the treasury adjustment amounting to 5% of GDP in a way that wasn't painful for the people. And we need to do it quickly. We started to bounce back as from April already. And if we didn't do the job in the central bank, we could have had hyperinflation. And that's also thanks to the work of Toto Caputo and Santiago Bausili, who heads the central bank, and also our finance secretary, Pablo Quino. These things are very important. Sorry, I'm taking away some of your time going into these detailed answers, but they're very important. And clearly, what you say is actually happening, because the IMF has actually invited our deregulation minister, Federico Sturzenegger, for him to share the experience of what we're doing in Argentina. And I will now make a point which is not minor. This is important to get the picture. When you look at the history of economic growth, the last 200 or 250 years of great, wonderful growth, this growth revolution we've had, thanks to which humans today live and are better off than emperors at any time in the past, this was due to the emergence of economic growth, the flip side of which is increasing returns, which in neoclassical economic theory are at loggerheads with the competitive model, the perfect competition model, which can't generate growth. Now, what is the problem? Increasing returns involve monopolies or concentrated structures. So when you look at a business and regulate it and want to make it look like some competitive company, what you're doing through regulations is to kill growth. And this is something that Kristalina Georgieva mentioned. She said, we see that total factor productivity is falling because of the situation regarding the regulations. This is why what Federico Sturzenegger and what Elon Musk is now doing in the United States, he's, even in North Korea.
It's applicable in other places. I wonder, because in Europe we have all these people who are sitting there and who have barely shrunk government at all, who barely, do you regard them as kind of wimps? Are they people who have not taken on government in the same way as you have?
Bueno, al lado mío son todos tímidos.
Well, next to me they're all wimps, right?
A familiar modesty.
Pero lo que digo es, sí, es que hay un problema de compatibilidad de incentivos.
There's an issue regarding the incompatibility of incentives, because I come from outside politics. I'm an outsider, and I believe in this kind of adjustment, it's politics that needs to result, and most of the politicians
in Europe and in
most of the world, the ones that only occupy a chair in Brussels, make a point of creating an environment to be better off themselves, not for people to be well off. And this is why they have introduced so many regulations, and this is why Europe is the part of the world that is growing the least. So we need to give power back to the people, to citizens. We need to break the fetters that enslave you to through regulations or through taxes. In fact, all regulations are absurd. So for as long as politicians are not willing to surrender their privilege, they will continue to kill growth. And you know what? I take the presidency as a job. I have a job description, which is to lower inflation, to reduce poverty, to end insecurity, and to make the economy grow. And you know what I'm going to do once I'm done? I'm going to deliver lectures.
You have midterm elections coming up, where all the things you've said will be on display. And your current approval ratings are quite high. But as you know, all the things you've talked about, there has also been pain for people in Argentina. As you've cut, as you've done things, what do you expect to happen in those midterms? Because if you don't get backing there for all this macho talk, you could be in trouble.
A ver, Doloroso es lo que ha vivido
Well,
Argentina en los
painful
últimos
is
100
what
años.
Argentina has gone through in the past 100 years. Having been one of the wealthiest countries, it has become a miserable country at the lower end of the spectrum. I think that is painful. I didn't create 57% poverty. I only inherited it. What I did was acknowledge the fact. I brought it down by 21 points in a year, and I adjusted the economy and politics, and still the economy expanded. So I didn't apply a painful recipe. I gave freedom back to the Argentines and improved the earnings. The average wages in the formal market went from $300 to $1,100. And given that the Argentine currency is no longer so depreciated, per capita GDP is 120% larger now, and the Argentines are way better off. This is why the approval ratings for our administration are around 60%. And if the election were today, we would get 50% of the vote. So there's broad consensus around our policies. People are getting it. The problem is not people. The problem is politicians who are losing out as part of this.
One last thing. Do you worry at all? You are a great student of economic reform in other places, is that people can often have this huge push at the beginning. We saw this with people like Margaret Thatcher, maybe Ronald Reagan as well. But then after a bit, the momentum gets into trouble. What keeps you going at the speed you are going at the moment?
Esto es muy importante lo que usted acaba de preguntar.
Well, what you've just asked is very important, because we look at politics on three fronts, on three lanes. One is management, administration as such. We've lowered inflation, the economy is growing, poverty has really come down tremendously, and insecurity is a thing of the past. So the administration is working. And what we have achieved in our administration is so important that our brilliant security minister went to the IMF to explain how we managed to maintain social order even amidst such a huge adjustment. The other track, and we've got the person in charge here, that's the political track. We are building our own political structure, and that's my sister's responsibility. And whereas many have tried to build their own parties and they've spent 5 or 10 years without being able to do so, my sister managed to do this in only 5 months, so congratulations, boss. And there's yet another element that is crucial, what we call the culture battle. Economic achievements do not suffice, nor do political achievements. If society, if the people fail to understand that the road to prosperity is about embracing the ideas of freedom, they may have an administration, a term or two, but three, but that will be lost.
To change the culture?
No lo sé.
I wish I knew. What I do know is that I need to give it a try, and that's what we are actively working on too.